This episode, we're going to talk a little bit about suicide risk. So, again, think back to my example with basic training. You are taught to figure things out. You are taught to take your emotions and shove them down. You need to be self-sufficient. As an aside, I know a veteran who has this great story about how he was tasked with getting some ice for his unit. I don't know why that was a task, but he was. He was given no other guidance aside from that. So he ends up going to the place where all the ice is. He bribes somebody with apricot brandy, one of the guards there, and the guard was all happy about that. So he gives him all this ice, and he drives it back to his CO, and the CO was just shocked. He's like, how the heck did you get all this ice? And of course, he never said, but that's the kind of thing that you're tasked with doing. You have a mission. You need to accomplish it. There's not always going to be a straight path forward. But what if you feel like you can't accomplish that mission? What if you feel like that training is kicking in and you can't even really talk about how you're feeling hopeless, you're feeling like a bit of a failure? You can't really live up to the tough soldier mentality. Well, that's going to come through as something else, and unfortunately too often it tends to be suicide. So veterans account for about 14% of all U.S. adult suicides, despite comprising only 7.6% of the population. That is a 1.5 times higher rate than non-veterans. And in 2022, an average of about 18 veteran suicides occurred each day. So when I work with veterans, they tend to get annoyed when I talk about suicide and asking them about it. This is the reason, because this is an issue that plagues a lot of veterans, and it's something that is preventable. It is, as best as we can. Right? We can't stop somebody from committing suicide. So I guess I'll backtrack. It's not that it's preventable. It's that there are so many resources to help people out there that maybe ultimately they think that they can't take advantage of them. It's going to look bad if they ask for help. Yet the reality is you don't need to make that permanent decision for what is likely a temporary situation. So something to think about when you see veterans who are maybe isolating a bit, talking a lot about how everything's bad, or they're trying to kind of hide things. And by hide things, I'm thinking like hiding their emotions. And again, it doesn't mean that they're automatically going to commit suicide. It just means that they're at an increased risk. So checking in on that, giving them the Veterans Crisis Line, letting them know that you care about them, that can really make a big difference. Another issue that is closely tied to emotion regulation, reintegration, and we'll talk a little bit about those in a moment, but it's PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, keep in mind that not everyone serving is going to see combat. In fact, I heard this stat once. This one I haven't verified, but it sounds true, which is about 20% of people that serve are actually going to see some kind of combat scenario. That sounds about right to me. It might be a little lower, a little higher, depending on what active conflicts are happening in the world at any given moment. But most people aren't going to be in an active war zone. And PTSD, people usually think, and maybe even veterans, in fact, not maybe, yes, even veterans think that PTSD is only for people that served in a combat zone. But the reality is that trauma shows up in a ton of different ways. And I talked a lot more about this in my Therapy 101 episode on trauma. So if you want a deeper dive into that, go check that out. But really, when you think about veterans, trauma can occur not only in the regular context as civilians, could be from family, could be, a car crash, whatever the case may be. But if we're focusing specifically on service, yes, combat exposure can cause trauma. There's also sexual assault that can happen in the military, which is unfortunate, but it does happen. And it could come about from what we call moral injury. So the way that you view the world, people are just, and you have your own set of morals, and then you are told to act in a way that goes against those morals. What are you supposed to do with that? That can traumatize somebody depending on the situation. Sometimes trauma can come about from other things as well. As I mentioned, injuries can happen. One veteran I had the pleasure of working with talked about just being on his ship, and all of a sudden there was this awful fire, and many people ended up dying in the fire. And he still thinks about what happened. At least at the time I'd worked with him. Hopefully he's gotten some great treatment since then. But these things can really, really haunt veterans. Again, keep in mind, you are an army of one. Even if you weren't in the army, you're taught to be a soldier of one. And so thinking about, discussing trauma with somebody, that's a weakness. Can't have that. So in the meantime, what are those veterans dealing with? All your common symptoms of PTSD, including flashbacks, including hypervigilance, so constantly being on guard, even if they're at a place like Walmart, where there can be a lot of goofy people at Walmart, but it's generally not a threatening place, yet they have to be on guard. You go out to a restaurant with them, hey, back's got to be to the wall and they got to be facing the door. Nightmares, maybe emotional numbness. So really, when we think about some stats here, the lifetime prevalence of PTSD in U.S. veterans is about 7% compared to 6% in civilians, with rates reaching 9 to 20% among post-9/11 veterans. Though, of course, that data is a little skewed because, which I'll get into in a moment with an anecdote, but you have to think about the actual term PTSD. It wasn't coined until it was either 83 or 84. Prior to that, it was shell shock syndrome. And a lot of people didn't talk about that kind of thing back then because they just thought, well, I didn't go to Vietnam. I don't have shell shock syndrome, so I must not have PTSD. I must not have any kind of trauma disorder because, again, PTSD wasn't labeled at that point. So I suspect that the rates are probably higher than we think, especially because people are suffering in silence. PTSD often has a lot of isolation associated with it too. Now, VA data tends to suggest that about 14% of male veterans and 24% of female veterans were diagnosed with PTSD in fiscal year 2024. Closely related to PTSD, although you don't need PTSD to have these problems, they tend to go hand in hand though. There can be emotion regulation difficulties. So this is where veterans are going to have challenges in managing their intense emotions. Not always from trauma or chronic stress, but oftentimes that happens. So things like impulsivity, numbness, this can be an issue. In fact, about 56% of veterans with PTSD reported clinically relevant emotion dysregulation scores. And of course, this doesn't stop. It didn't start just as someone becomes a veteran. In fact, difficulties are prevalent in about 51 to 77% of studies examining coping strategies among active military personnel. So again, they learn it in the military, and this is setting aside any family stuff, family of origin stuff. So they learn it in the military, and then of course it can be difficult to regulate emotions once they leave, and if you put PTSD on top of that, that is going to be heavy. Which again ties into the very last point here in terms of really big issues that veterans deal with, and that's reintegration into civilian life. Again, thinking about the structure, being told what to do day in and day out, to then leaving that environment, and you've done that for years, leaving that environment, and now you have to return to the civilian world. There's a whole bunch of different norms that civilians live by, including employment. I mean, you're not just told, oh, you got to do this now and you're going to do this now. You actually have to go find a job. Relationships, a lot of times, friends and family are going to struggle relating to someone who's a veteran because the veteran feels like they can't understand them, right? The veteran. And then family members, they try, but then the veterans can be kind of, again, not secretive, but just kind of like keep things to themselves, downplay things, because again, they want to be the tough veteran. And of course, think about identity shifts too. You're an active duty military member, and now all of a sudden you're just a regular guy. Yeah, you're a veteran, but that in and of itself doesn't elevate you in some way versus thinking about, you can go anywhere with a uniform on. A lot of times people will say, oh, thank you for your service and, let me get your meal or whatever the case may be. And now you're just a guy. You're just a guy or a girl, a lady. So peer-reviewed research indicates that about 50% of veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan experience some reintegration difficulties associated with poorer mental health outcomes, lower social support, and reduced flourishing. So as promised, let me give you an example of what all this looks like to tie all of this together. Because while I listed all of these different categories, and again, just as a recap, PTSD, depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, traumatic brain injury, suicide risk, emotion regulation difficulties, and reintegration into civilian life, while these things can be separate, they often come in pairs or more. So I had the pleasure of working with Vietnam veterans, across my career with in helping veterans out. But there was one group in particular that I will never forget them. They were always very nice to me, but they would share their stories, and it was really eye-opening. So picture this. It's 1960 whatever, 1970 whatever. I can't quite remember the exact years on Vietnam. And, you'd get your letter in the mail. They had their lottery cards, if I remember correctly. And then, your number gets called. And, well, I guess you're going. You got drafted. So you got to go. You go through basic, which, again, is a tough situation anyways. And a lot of the guys, chomping at the bit. Okay, I'm here. Well, then let's go. Let's do this thing. So maybe they get called up. Let's say they do. They get called up. They hop on a plane. They fly all the way over to Vietnam, down to Saigon, and they're ready to go. Then they get in their transports and they get shipped off into the jungle. Some of the things that the veterans experienced in those jungles are just absolutely horrific. Absolutely horrific. I'm not going to go into too intense details just for the sake of, a polite conversation here on this podcast. Well, I guess it's more of a monologue, isn't it? But suffice it to say, some awful things happened. Being in close quarters combat in those tunnels that the Viet Cong and the NVA dug. Pitch black. You can't see anything, and you can't turn on a light because if you do, you might be dead. American service members' bodies horrifically mutilated. Of course, being exposed to Agent Orange, seeing civilians being used as soldiers. You don't really know, who is actually safe to be around, who's not. In fact, the veterans would talk about, you have to be careful about even coasters, because while they sat there and I forget what the alcohol was that they would drink, but they play their cards. Every once in a while they go to a new place and set something down on a coaster and it would blow up. I don't know how often that happened, but it did happen. Of course, some of the village children, they'd like the Americans and go up to them, and then later on, maybe they were strapped with explosives. That tended to happen more in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it happened. Some kids that they got fond of just wouldn't come back anymore because they died. Just really awful stuff. So you do this for a set number of years, however long that was. And then you're told, okay, it's time for you to leave the military. You served, great. So of course you go back to Saigon, and then you hop on a plane, and 1-2 days later you go from the jungle to California. You get your DD-214, which is your discharge paperwork from the military, and they say thank you for your service, good luck, and you're off into the world. And you're off into a world where people are spitting on veterans, active duty service members. They're calling them baby killers. And here you are returning to a country that you just fought for, and that's what you're experiencing. Not to mention, one plane ride does not take away all of the memories, all of the habits that you formed. Being in such an intense combat zone, that doesn't go away. So, in fact, for many Vietnam veterans, what they ended up doing, they didn't talk about anything that happened to them. They shoved it all down, usually with substances, although kind of the biggest thing that you'd see is they would bury themselves in their work. And I don't have shell shock syndrome, or they go to the doctor and the doctor wouldn't know any better, and they go, oh, okay, yeah, you're fine, you're working, so it's no big deal. Even though they were suffering internally, having a tough time relating to other people, regulating their emotions, and they just tried to shove it down. So years would go by, and then guess what happened? One day they woke up and they turned 65. And they got to retire. Well, what happens when you can't bury yourself in your work anymore? Now all the memories come back even harder. So it was really around that time that you started to see significant issues with Vietnam veterans, more so than prior to that. And thankfully, a lot of them ultimately went to the VA to get some help. You were seeing the same thing to a certain degree with Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, because they are told, hey, you had all these awful things happen to you, go get treatment. So of course, they're more likely to come in. They're younger, of course, a younger cohort at this point. But a lot of times something will happen, disability, they're losing their job, they can't bury themselves in something, and so they go get help. You also, I've had the pleasure of working with some Gulf War veterans as well, Desert Storm, Desert Shield, and they kind of the same thing. Things will happen in their lives where they can't avoid anymore. Maybe the body can't handle the substances that they are used to using to avoid. And now they got to get some treatment to help out. So, I mean, all of these issues tend to go hand in hand. And again, you might be a veteran yourself who's just dealing with one or two of these things. But again, let's take trauma out of it. Let's just say you're dealing with some depression, some anxiety. You're a little more at risk for that being a veteran. Well, that might also kind of tie into being able to regulate your emotions, talk about them, manage them in some kind of effective way. Well, you might need some kind of treatment to help you with that. It's not, again, these things aren't failures, by the way. That often tends to come up with veterans. I'm a failure for wanting to ask for help. Whether it's something serious or not as serious. And again, I have a hard time saying certain things are more serious, less serious, because yes, objectively we can say, someone in a combat zone, is probably dealing with more than somebody who maybe had some trouble just reintegrating back into society. At the same point in time, difficulties are difficulties, whatever the individual is. Everyone has their own unique story. So get some help for that. I oftentimes have to tell veterans, listen, I know you're told to figure things out, but at the end of the day, it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage to reach out to somebody who you've never met before, whether that's through the VA or whether that is through some other resource, and say, hey, I'm not doing well. I'm having some problems with my mental health. That is not something that veterans are used to saying. In fact, they were actively discouraged from saying such things. So it takes a lot to enter into treatment.